Good morning, everybody. This is the thought for the week for Wednesday, the 19th of August, 2020. I'm Diane, one of the ministry team in Wisley with Perford, and today I'm going to bring you a thought for the week about the parable of the labourers in the vineyard. It's found in Matthew chapter 20, verses 1 to 16. For the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire labourers for his vineyard. After agreeing with the labourers for the usual daily wage, he sent them into his vineyard. When he went out about 9 o'clock, he saw others standing idle in the marketplace, and he said to them, "You also go into the vineyard, and I will pay you whatever is right." So they went. When he went out again about noon and about 3 o'clock, he did the same. And about 5 o'clock he went out and found others standing around, and he said to them, "Why are you standing here idle all day?" They said to him, "Because no one has hired us." He said to them, "You also go into the vineyard." When the evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his manager, "Call the labourers and give them their pay, beginning with the last and going to the first." When those hired about 5 o'clock came, each of them received the full usual daily wage. Now when the first came, they thought they would receive more, but each of them also received the usual daily wage. And when they received it, they grumbled against the landowner, saying, "These last worked only 1 hour, and you have made them equal to us, who have borne the burden of the day and the scorching heat." But he replied to one of them, "Friend, I am doing you no wrong. Did you not agree with me for the usual daily wage? Take what belongs to you and go. I choose to give this last the same as I give to you. Am I not allowed to do what I choose with what belongs to me? Or are you envious because I am generous? So the last will be first, and the first will be last." Well, my first thought about this is that in those days they worked very long hours. If he was out hiring well before 9 o'clock and still hiring people at 5 to work into the evening. But let's try and bring this a little bit more contemporary. Imagine the government puts a wealth tax on houses of 3 bedrooms or more. In the current recession, that's not beyond the realms of possibility. Imagine they decide to have a flat tax of £1,000 a year. Is that fair? If you live in a 3-bedroom house, you might be thinking, it's only just big enough for your family, so why should you have to pay extra tax on it? Shouldn't people with 5-bedroom houses have to pay more? If you live in a 5-bedroom house around here, you might be retired and be thinking, I've got a large house, but there's no one living here who's earning anything, so we shouldn't have to pay the extra tax. And anyway, what about the people who live in St. George's Hill? They have mega mansions and must have loads of money. Shouldn't they pay more? And what if you were fortunate enough to own a mega mansion in St. George's Hill? You might think that you've worked really hard for your beautiful home, and you run a business that employs lots of people, and you already pay loads of tax. Alternatively, you might think that only £1,000 a year, the same as everyone else, absolute result. And at the other end of the spectrum, if you live in a small flat in Shearwater, you might also think that's a great idea. It's not going to affect you. In our hypothetical situation here, what is everyone doing? They're comparing themselves against each other and seeing whether they think the idea is fair. And those who won't want to complain are the ones who think they're getting a good deal compared to others. There's an element of competition here, because people usually only complain when they feel they're missing out. Look at the nightmare of the A-level results chaos. Not that I want to comment on that situation at all, because I know it's been very painful for some families, But we can see the human response here clearly. The students who did better than expected were not the ones complaining. The ones feeling hard done by are those who expected more. So it seems to me that the human sense of fairness has elements of competition and expectation. And in my experience, this sense of fairness is embedded in humans from when they are very young. I remember one of my children coming home from reception class one day and complaining that some of the children got treats for behaving the same way that everyone else was expected to behave all the time. And I remember at that point as describing it as a very strong sense of justice. But this passage makes me wonder whether fairness and justice are the same thing. God is just, but life is not fair. I'll just repeat that. God is just, but life is not fair. We might write that off as living in a fallen world, but I think it's a bit more complex than that. Jesus says we will always have the poor with us. And in the Bible, there's also this idea of building up treasures in heaven, which suggests that even in heaven, some people may have more than others. So what's going on here? This passage in Matthew is one of a series of teachings about what the kingdom of heaven is like. Firstly, in Matthew 9:14, Jesus said the kingdom of heaven belongs to those such as little children. The disciples had been trying to keep the children away from Jesus because they weren't important enough to bother him. But Jesus was saying that the kingdom of heaven belongs to those without status. Next, the rich young man who was keeping the commandments was grieved because he couldn't contemplate giving away all his money. Jesus says in Matthew 19:23 that it will be hard for a rich person to enter the kingdom of heaven. The kingdom, therefore, seems to belong to those with no status and little money. Those who, in terms of human succession planning, might least deserve it. The parable of the labourers in the vineyard is bracketed by this countercultural idea that the first will be last and the last will be first. Those who in human terms seem most deserving will be put to the back of the queue. This is not fairness as we see it, but this parable shows the process of God's justice. As we heard, the landowner goes out at various times of the day and asks people to work in the vineyard for a suitable wage. The first workers he hires according to the usual contract, a full day's work for 1 denarius, which was the expected daily rate for a labourer or a soldier. And with the workers who are hired later in the day, he agrees to pay them whatever is right. Now you and I, and clearly the original hires, think that that means a pro rata rate to the work that they do. But the landowner chooses to give them all 1 denarius for the day, no matter what time they started, and he's not interested in any moaning about it either. In this story, we can see both the elements we thought about earlier. The landowner starts with the later hires in a way that is visible to the first hires. He could easily have paid those who worked all day first to avoid any conflict, but Jesus deliberately highlights the element of expectation. And why should those first hires expect more than their contracted denarius? It's only because they compare their effort to the others who did less work. The element of competition. Nothing has changed in their relationship or their contract with the landowner. The landowner calls them friend. He's not become antagonistic towards them. He suggests that the problem is their envy. The central issue of their grumbling is that the landowner has made the others equal to them. They see the generosity offered to the others as taking away from their status and therefore what they deserve. But God asks us as Christians to think about it the other way around. The kingdom of heaven has different values to the secular world. Matthew's teaching culminates in chapter 23 with the two greatest commandments. Jesus tells us that after loving God, our most important command is to love your neighbour as yourself. In Romans 12, the description of love that's so classic and all-encompassing says, "Be devoted to one another in brotherly love. Honour one another above yourselves, and share with God's people who are in need." God's idea of justice is not fairness in the eyes of the world. It is social justice, which cares about those who need generosity shown towards them. Perhaps those labourers who were hanging around in the town square during the day were not hired earlier because of their disabilities. Perhaps they missed the first cut because they walked more slowly and couldn't make it to the marketplace in time. Shouldn't they be shown mercy and generosity? But what if some were just lazy and didn't show up until lunchtime? Surely they don't deserve generosity then? But God chooses to show it anyway. And thank goodness he does. Because aren't we all with the lazy crowd sometimes? Do any of us deserve the grace that God chooses to shower upon us? Do any of us deserve the sacrifice Jesus chose to make for us? No. Jesus chose to leave heaven to come to earth. He didn't have to, but he came so that we wouldn't miss out. He loves us so much that he wants us to be there with him. We deserve to miss out. We deserve to have less than he has. But he wants to share every heavenly blessing with us. His justice is motivated by gratitude and generosity, not fairness. So the last will be first, and the first will be last. The parable we've just talked about is bracketed within this unexpected statement, and it's immediately followed by Jesus predicting his death. He who should have the first place in our world was treated unfairly. He was killed as a criminal. But that was an act of God's generous justice. Romans chapter 3 verses 25 to 26 says this: God presented him as a sacrifice of atonement through faith in his blood. He did this to demonstrate his justice, because in his forbearance he had left the sins committed beforehand unpunished. He did it to demonstrate his justice at the present time, so as to be just and the one who justifies those who have faith in Jesus. Human fairness is rooted in expectation and competition. God's justice has its foundation in love, gratitude, and generosity. As I considered how to apply this teaching, I thought about the end of the book of John. Jesus is walking on the beach with Peter. He's restored Peter after his 3 denials. Jesus asks him 3 times, "Do you love me?" And he asks Peter to feed my sheep. Then at the end, when they're all hunky-dory again, Peter looks over his shoulder and sees the disciple John behind him. And he says to Jesus, "What about him?" Again, the elements of expectation and competition come to the fore. And Jesus basically says, don't worry about him. Follow me and concentrate on what I've given you to do. Jesus wants us to follow him using the gifts that he's given us, staying in his will for us, and showing gratitude and generosity to others. We need to move away from a human understanding of fairness and move into an understanding of God's generous justice. I'd like to finish off by reading a piece of Psalm 89. It's verses 13 to 18. You have a mighty arm, Strong is your hand, high your right hand. Righteousness and justice are the foundation of your throne. Steadfast love and faithfulness go before you. Happy are people who know the festal shout, who walk, O Lord, in the light of your countenance. They exult in your name all day long and extol your righteousness. For you are the glory of their strength. By your favour our horn is exalted. For our shield belongs to the Lord, our King to the Holy One of Israel. I love that. Righteousness and justice are the foundation of your throne, and steadfast love and faithfulness go before you. So let's, as we go out into the coming week, think about having our foundation in righteousness and the generous justice that God shows us and that he expects us to show others. And may steadfast love and faithful go before all of us. In Jesus' name, amen.